Our third initiatory level corresponds to the element of water. In the tarot, this is represented as the suit of cups, the heart of God. In the human condition, it's our emotions. But more than our emotions, it's the key that integrates the two levels beneath it.
That's certainly true in the Qabalah. I believe it's Bria above Yetzirah, because mind is viewed as kind of relatively primitive compared to emotion. The emotional body is closer to God, closer to reality, the feeling it, than the evolutionarily later experience of now formulating it through idea and thought. That's a more recent development, and it never can be as pure as the ability to flow in a kind of a feeling sense, a sentience with it.
The initiatory level corresponding to the element of water, sometimes it's reflective of the subconscious mind, but more often we think of it in terms of our emotion. It's our emotional life. And just as we needed mastery over the physical body, just as we needed mastery over our intellect, so too, at the initiatory level corresponding to water, we need to master our emotions.
Water has been an age-old symbol of the emotions. If you look at the Old Testament, the way of dealing with water is you part the Red Sea, get through as quick as you can before it closes over on top of you. In the New Testament, it's calming the troubled seas, walking on top of the water. You don't throw away the water.
Emotions, I think, have an evolutionary value in that they, as part of the instrument of the soul, are teaching you about how to live effectively in this physical, dense world. And they are also the primary mechanism by which you can relate to others.
And so the training of the emotions, which is where most people live, is a vital part of that building a stable base, a personality through which the soul can work. The emotions have a vital part to play in creativity, in bringing things from the abstract into objectification. But the emotions can't rule. The emotions can't choose everything all the time.
As I would learn, the emotional body is an essential component in the great work. When purified and brought into service of the higher self, the emotions are a trusted carriage. But when emotions rule, trouble soon follows. John West brought up a related idea, a Gurdjieffian teaching tale that very succinctly illustrated the importance of freedom through emotional autonomy.
Again, back to teaching tales. This is one actually derived from Gurdjieff, but it's a handy line. which is whoever and whatever presses your buttons is your master. And if you decide you don't want to be a slave all your life, then the objective is to not get your buttons pushed. And if you can get to the point where at least they're not pushed as hard, already that's something. And it changes, it's a little thing, but it changes everything.
Another great Gurdjieffian thought tool is getting into the habit of thinking of our vibrational output, our thoughts and feelings, as real, tangible things of a subtle nature, not directly observable, but like gravity, radiation, magnetism. Its effect can be readily observed.
Remember we talked about how most of us intake the energy from the world around us through our solar plexus? Well, there's no filter on the solar plexus.
You know, they talk about an epidemic and publish articles about it, and everybody goes through a kind of fear warp.
You take in this energy. You take in everything.
You know, the experience of seeing a movie in a theater is always funnier or scarier because you're in a group emotional field. And when you watch it on TV at home by yourself, it's not quite the same experience.
So you get other people's energy. You get other people's feelings about you. And you will be affected by them because that's where you're taking in the energy with no thought, no filtering.
This is the dynamic that drives the mob kind of mentality in a negative way.
One of the reasons it's so difficult to work with our emotional body is because it's not just ours alone. Our physical bodies, generally speaking, we don't share. Unless you've got, you know, maybe organ transplants or you're possessed. But pretty much, you know, it's you, it's yours, you know the boundaries of it. But it is said, and I think it's fairly obvious too, that we all share an emotional field. We, some say, swim in the same emotional soup. And that's how people can have relationships. That's how crowds in a theater will get together with their feelings and enhance the experience of being in a theater, or at a sports event. Or that's how jingoism works to, you know, get people all fired up to go do something militaristic.
So the emotion is this field that we all live in, that we can't see with our physical eyes.
We have this big astral body, and it's often called a morphogenic field, is one of the names for it. Sanskrit word would be deva. You're talking about a unit of things, an entity of something, within which there are many parts.
But it's this ocean of currents of our own making, but also we're picking up on the emotions and the vibes of place, what's been laid down in that place before. You know, you can walk into a home and know whether people have been happy there or bad things have happened there. You know, you walk into the parks of some of the concentration camps and they're very pretty and they're very beautiful as a memorial, but they still feel bad. You go to the Tower of London, it still feels creepy, you know? It's because of the overlay of emotion on emotion on emotion over centuries. And so that's part of this emotional world. What's moving through the collective, like fear warps because of earthquakes. There's an earthquake that happens in Thailand and Southern California gets antsy because we're reacting to that emotional form that's circulating.
But the point of it is, it doesn't just belong to you. So you're swimming in this astral soup, you're operating in this morphogenic field, and you are affected by everything else that's going on out there. And a lot of the wisdom teachers will talk about this and how important it is to begin to be able to distinguish what's going on in the environment around you from what actually belongs to you. The nice thing about building an ajna center then is you take in the energy around you through your ajna center. And And you can actually feel that shift. It's amazing. It's a subtle but noticeable shift. So once you start processing, taking in energy and the input from the world at your ajna center, it goes through your frontal lobes. And you can analyze it, and you can say, I feel a disturbance in the force. Is it mine? And you can say, no, I don't think nothing's bothering me to speak of. It must not be my problem. Therefore, I will not get upset by it. But it gives you a tool with which to deal more calmly and more logically with the world around you. We don't want to be tossed willy-nilly and hither and yon, so it's about learning how to observe and then be able to not necessarily control, but to have a perspective on the emotions, that we understand what's going on.
Part of the initiatory process is learning to listen and gain more and more information on each of the registers of existence, and perhaps even more importantly, distinguish between them.
The minute you start talking about controlling the emotions, people think suppression. We know suppression doesn't work. It makes you sick. You suppress your emotions, it's going to work out in some way. For instance, the CEO yells at his subordinates, and those subordinates yell at the underlings, and the underlings either have to take it and sit on it, or unconsciously they catch their hand in a drawer so they can have something to yell at. Or they go home and yell at their dog. If you don't release it, you internalize it, and it's going to work out as some disease. People, in my parents' generation that lived through World War II, that was an age when men didn't cry. You didn't talk about how terrible the war was, and you didn't drug yourself into forgetting how terrible it was. You just sucked it up. And a lot of people that have the pattern of suppressing their emotions develop stomach cancers, pancreatic problems, intestinal disorders. That's all that area of the emotions in the body. It's really interesting when you begin to look at that. The West is handicapped right out of the gate because we've grown up with the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments is the only spiritual code for the masses that's written in the negative. Thou shalt not. And so people think, well, if I don't lie, and I don't cheat, and I don't commit adultery, and I don't kill anybody, if I don't do all the don'ts, I'll be a spiritual person. Well, mostly that just means they've suppressed everything. But it doesn't mean that you're now a spiritual person. It's not stopping the bad. It's building the good. It's changing it. You don't stop or suppress a negative emotion and pretend it's not there. It doesn't work and it's ineffective anyway. You have to transform it. You have to change it into something positive.
In the alchemical allegory, emotions are a necessary ingredient which makes possible the synthesis of all the elements into the philosopher's stone.
This is the real meaning about the story of turning the other cheek. If you look at that as a dynamic, when someone hits you, you have three choices. You can hit back. It's quick, effective, finishes off the karma. Nobody learns anything, and it perpetuates the pattern. There's that wonderful Irish folk song about the conflict in Northern Ireland, where an eye for an eye for an eye for an eye until everyone is blind. A lot of humanity is still living on that eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth concept. It just perpetuates the cycle. We could spend ages going through this karmic tennis match I'm the perpetrator, you're the victim, you're the perpetrator, I'm the victim. We've got to change the game. We've got to make it so nobody has to play that game ever again. We can get a new game for everybody. The suppression of the emotions doesn't work. There have to be techniques that allow you to take that emotional energy and turn it into something positive, and so that it becomes a positive expression.
Our ability to operate from our highest centers allows us to proactively diffuse or even transmute negative situations. This is an example of not identifying. We are not our emotions. We are having, creating, and watching our emotions.
Again, going back to the turn the other cheek. Instead of hitting back, your second option is to stand there and do nothing. Well, that doesn't really teach anybody anything either. It stops the pattern from continuing through you, but that person's going to go out and hit somebody else. And it makes you a doormat. And the spiritual person is never a doormat. You see the stereotypes of these sweet, gentle people. But standing for the truth has never been easy. It's never been popular. And this common phrase of going with the flow, one of my students years ago said, only dead fish go with the flow. The spiritual seeker must be that Celtic trout of wisdom that swims upstream against the status quo and forge a new way.
What we're after is to be rising vertically up the centers, up the path of initiation. Not to totally leave everything behind, but to be able to access it consciously and at our bidding.
And so you have in the mystery traditions the training of the emotions, the training of the mind, the integrating of all these parts of the personality. That is then an instrument through which the soul can really work. That is then the marriage partner in an alchemical sense. The bride becomes your workmate, not your enemy.
The great work as it applies to the emotional plane involves the transmutation of our emotions from an unstable force of chaos into a reliable compass and essential component of the integrated psyche.
So the nice thing about building an ajna center is, remember, it is the collection, the balancing and integration of all the other centers, which means you don't have to stay up there. Sometimes it's appropriate to go to one of the other centers. And that's the neat part about it, is that you now have access to all of those other aspects. So when it's time to run from the lion chasing you, you don't sit in your ajna and go, lion. You drop to your root center, your adrenaline kicks in, and you're out of there. Or when it's time for romance, you don't stay in the ajna center, you go to the romance centers. Or whatever the case might be. But the point of it is, you don't just live in the lower centers. You have your predominant dwelling in the ajna center, and then you have access at any time, in any place, in any way, to the other centers.
The second to the highest Kabbalistic world in the Yod-He, Vav-He initiatory formula is that first He. Now, in the human condition, the Kabbalists call it the soul intuition. It's a level of consciousness that is not limited by time and space. In the tarot, this is represented by the suit of cups. It's literally the heart of God.
The heart is viewed as the most intelligent organ. The compassion, it's the mind, it's the heart-mind. As the Buddhists talk about the mind as being in the heart. The seat of consciousness is here in Buddhism. The heart-mind.
Very interesting. A very interesting concept. The heart is the seat of conscience. And recently, only in the last couple of weeks, I think, or months, I've been reading medical reports that say that the heart is not, after all, as we're taught in our Church of Progress, simply a pump to push the blood through our bodies, but that it in fact does, in some way or another, reflect or contain those characteristics that have come down to us from antiquity and which are part of common language. You don't get the woman you love, your heart broken, or your heart sick, or your heart throb, etc., etc., etc. The heart really does play that role, and in the court of Osiris, the heart will betray you if you've been lying to yourself and to the world.
In Tibetan Buddhism, it's the principle called bodhicitta. It's the integration of wisdom and compassion, which is the highest expression of Buddha, or enlightenment. Because, I think in this conversation, it's because a recognition that the heart is such an advanced stage of consciousness, and what the real heart is the experience of love for all beings. We're talking about love in a transpersonal way. It's a blissful, deep emotional experience that is like a high stage of meditation. And the object of it is all beings. It's a very elevated state of being to get bodhicitta. And to see that state of this kind of this ecstatic emotional state of love is actually the best realm to process higher consciousness from. Wisdom comes really alive in ideas and transcendent thought, etc., in that stage.
At the highest spectrum of the emotional realm is the mysterious phenomenon of intuition.
Naturally, one aspect of water is that of our subconscious mind. But water as an element reflecting on our souls is really a much bigger concept than that. The initiatory level corresponding to water transcends both the body and the mind. In doing so, it also transcends time and space. From the point of view of our identity as water, our bodies and minds are just small terminals reflective of the great reality that is our water consciousness.
Georgia, as usual, took me through a literal quantum leap in my understanding of this lofty dynamic by clarifying the stages one can pass through to perfect this divine aspect of ourselves.
A lot of what people call intuition is really instinct. Instinct is a function of the emotional nature, which is associated with water. So it's associated with not only animal instincts, but it's associated with dreams, with that sort of otherworldliness, the visionary mystic. But you progress from that kind of intuition to intellect, which is the training of the concrete mind, but you don't stay there. You go beyond the concrete mind to true intuition, which is a function of the soul. So it's instinct to intellect and then to intuition, which is not a function of the personality and its sensory and parasensory systems. It's a function of the all-knowingness of the soul, the omnipotence of the soul.
A good illustration of this soul intuition is the mother who wakes up in the middle of the night knowing that one of her children is in danger or is in trouble. It is so common that we don't even think of it as being an unusual occurrence. It does happen. Now, if that child was on the other side of town, the mother would have received this impression immediately, instantaneously. If the child had been on the other side of the earth, the same thing. She would have gotten the message instantly. If the child would have been on the moon, she would have still gotten the message instantly. Or on Alpha Centauri or light years away, she still would have received that message instantly. And that's not because the child actually transmitted a message, "Mom, I'm in trouble." That is because there's no place in the universe that the child could go that would be outside of the mother's neshama. It's bigger than the intellect. It's huge. It's a level of consciousness that is not limited by time and space. This is the first Hey in the Yod Hey Vav Hey formula. It's this level of consciousness that literally we all share with each other. Right now, we're sitting in the middle of each other's neshama, or soul intuition.
Because you know how often we all get upset when our friends are upset, or sometimes you'll feel kind of weird and then you'll find out that something happened to a friend of yours or someone in the family and you were affected by it.
Everybody has the intuitive function, and it's of all the functions, it's the one that's the most obvious, like your nose in front of your face that you can't see or that you miss. But of all the functions, intuition is the now. It's the now, not in terms of the object that's moving. It's the now in terms of the observer who's observing the object that's moving. It's the nature of the mind itself, in a way. It's the intuitive it's often the answer to the question, how do I know that? Or what am I doing right now? Or even more basic, my first thought about something. It's the idea of first thought, best thought. What comes up first? It's usually your intuitive mind. It's a direct response, and then typically we process it. We say, well, maybe I should process it. I'm pretty good at thinking. Maybe I'll break it down and analyze it and go through my various analytical processing it to see if I like my first thought. I gotta watch it, or I gotta test it. Science is great in terms of the physical sensation, and it's gotten so clever at setting up these little experiments where what they do is science tries to turn things as much as possible into physical things. Because physical things do the best in laboratory experiments. We can measure physical things. Feeling things, it's a little bit nebulous, right? Intuition, forget it. It's invisible. And thinking is the realm of philosophy. Thinking is the old way of knowledge. The lead people were the great thinkers of our day. But the scientists have taken over, and they've been terrific in a lot of what they do. But I have a lot of resistance to science in my own personal intuitive way of being. Only in that some scientists, not all, make a mistake, in my opinion, of an arrogant mistake of invalidating that which doesn't fit into their experiments or into the the physical parameters. It's like, well, if it can't be measured, it doesn't exist. And that's unfortunate because, you know, when we're talking about spirit, we're talking about the intuitive faculty, which is, in a way, is very much related to spirit. It's often the way that people that are looking for spirit experience spirit is through intuition. If that can't be measured, if that can't be thingified, reified, or turned into a physical thing, well, let's move on. Let's put it off the table because there's nothing we can really do with that. And that's one of the reasons why this has been left to only 25% or less. It's the dirty little secret. It's the underside of the Western culture is what's known through intuition and what's known through spirit.
In humanity's earlier life experience, humanity was much more in tune with the forces of nature than we are today. Humanity was naturally psychic. And so when we look at these wonderful ancient ruins that are so perfectly aligned with the stars and the planets, we think, wow, there was ancient knowledge. That may be true. However, it may be something else entirely. People built perfectly because it felt right, according to their instinct. The same way that cattle will walk all day and then choose a place to stop for the night, and that's where the Romans would build their cities, because it would be a good place. So humanity had this innate ability to tune into the forces of nature, to build properly, to sense their larger environment. Well, as we began to build the intellect, we had to move away from that. It's sort of like we had to move away from the womb of nature to establish our own self-identity. But then we will return to that at a higher turn of the spiral. And deep within every human being, there is both a sort of head and heart receptor that must be used together, because the head without the heart produces the manipulative dictator and scientist, but the heart without the head produces the stupid priest, and neither one serves God very well. So you have to have them combined. And when people have that sense of something ringing true, maybe they've never actually heard it before, but they hear it for the first time and it resonates with them at some level, what's responding is that intuitional head and heart mechanism. And in the future, people will learn to pay more attention to that.
Intuition is a word that means different things to different people. But if it is intuition, I would say it's more likely to be conscience. But whatever you call it, conscience or intuition, if that inner voice is telling you one thing, but instead you're doing what a lot of people around you are telling you should do, then you're not listening to your intuition or your conscience, whatever word you want to apply to it, and you should be.
One of the weirdest things, if one ever has a chance to, actually follow up on some of these things, is that often the person who is the one being supposedly kept in the dark about the affair will often begin to exhibit the characteristics of the other person that they're having an affair with. I don't know why, but all of a sudden, I want chocolate milkshakes. And the other person will go, oh, that's so weird. That's too spooky.
Cultures that recognize the energetic realms of human existence stress the importance of conscious monitoring of all our sensory input devices, including those that allow us to monitor the emotional states of others.
So an interesting thing happens when a person is on the path of initiation and they are doing the rise up through the chakras. When you get to the solar plexus, a lot of psychic phenomena starts to occur. And this is how a good teacher will know that the student has raised the kundalini, raised their awareness up to the solar plexus level. Because they will start hearing things, they'll start seeing things, they will start having greater incidences of ESP, all the psychic forces, if you will start coming into play. Now, the explanation for this is that the solar plexus is the chakra into which and through which most of us access the life force of the planet, prana. It's said that most of us, until we really get further along on the path, it's the intake valve for the energy all around us. Well, the energy all around us also contains the energy all around us and everything else that's out there. So if you don't have a filter on that intake valve, then you start accessing the astral world. You start accessing the elementals, you start accessing the devas, you start accessing all the astral stuff that's out there, and it's said to be a really busy place. So you find people saying, oh, I can see the angels. Oh, I can see the little fairies that live under the flowers. Well, maybe so. In esoteric anatomy, there's a really fascinating thing that gets into the blood and how different parts of humanity in more ancient history were able to access more of the world of nature. And that some peoples still have that ability, and they're able to literally talk to the plants and have a communication. Literally talk to the animals and have a two-way communication. And it's said that this is because they are very solidly centered in the solar plexus area, which is that open doorway to the astral world, which is a world of open communication. Now, what you're taught in most of the mystery schools is it's an interesting place to be, but don't get stuck there. And too many people do, either because it's fascinating or because it's frightening. They will get stuck there, or sometimes they'll even just back away completely from the spiritual path. And that's one of the reasons why it's really advisable to do this sort of work with a teacher who knows what they're talking about. Which is why people are advised, don't try this at home alone, right? Because it can get pretty wanky. Now, some might say, no such thing as, demons and fairies and all these spirits. Maybe not, but that's the experience that people have when they are in that particular energy arena. And we all know that the mind can create all kinds of things. So whether or not those are artifacts of our own consciousness, or whether you're actually interacting with a separate, unique entity, elves, fairies, angels, whatever, the point of it is learn what you can from it, but it's not the end-all and the be-all. There's more further up the way.
Because in fact, we have lots of inner voices, and in fact, if we're going to undertake anything difficult, the discipline, there will be an inner voice that says, the hell with this is a lot of work, let's go out and have a beer. So you have to be careful about intuition or conscience, but without it, it's that really that has to take you, that has to introduce you to the path in the first place, and then guide you along it. So it has to be listened to, but as I say, it has to be listened to with a certain amount of a certain discrimination and discernment to determine which inner voice it is that's talking. The inner voice that says, well, the hell with this, let's go have a beer, or the inner voice that said, this is something I really need to do.
So emotions are the tool of the gods, and what you are drawn to or what you are repelled by, absolutely, it's a signal, it's a signpost. The trick is to learn how to read it. That's where the hard work comes in.
The question of intuition is actually a very interesting one, because we all have it. Some people have it to a much more advanced and, let's say, evolved degree than others. There are ways in which supposedly you can develop your intuition.
In the rise up the chakras, in the rise on the path of initiation, the emotions are important. And this may not be an official party line, but this is what I think, is that they give us a taste of heaven. Okay? The emotions can bring forth physiologically the chemicals that can give you the euphoria, that can give you the joy, that can give you that detached I am one with all, particularly in the act of love, if it truly is an act of love. And when you experience that the world falls away, this is heaven and we are gods, well, that's fabulous. And that is that human version of what we are told is the divine. To quote myself from one of the stories that I wrote, desire is a tool of the gods to take us where we need to go, to learn the lessons we need to learn, and do the service we need to do. So for desire, you can substitute our emotions. So emotions are the tool of the gods. Does love belong in this particular step of the path? Absolutely it does. Just like the emotions are an echo of the divine, so too are our loves for each other an echo of the divine. Because a lot of the work on the path is to get to a point of detachment, a lot of times people can mistake that and think they have to cut off all their relationships. And some of the less clean teachers and organizations will do that, and they will order you to separate from your family or to break off from all those that you love. Oh, and give us your money too.
Any system that tells you you have to give up your will to a guru or anybody else, a red flag should go up. Your will needs to be trained, it needs to be developed, and foremost, it needs to be aligned with higher will. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something.
But I think the thing to remember is that the relationships that we have horizontally, ideally, will teach us about the relationship that we want to have vertically.
So, the control and training of the personality is part of the early stages of the mysteries. We don't throw away anything.
I think we all work with the issue of dealing with our urges, our instincts, our emotions, our desires, and it's a work in progress, as I see it. How we treat ourselves in this process is more important than our results. The most important thing is treating ourselves as we would want to treat others. It's kind of the reverse of the golden rule. And I think that it's often easier to be kind to others than to be kind to ourselves in this way. It's often easier to be kind to, particularly, say, a child or a pet or a stranger. And that when we get into our kind of psychology, when certain types of buttons are pushed in the relational world, and that sets us off. And that we listen to different kinds of voices in our heads. Okay. So I think it's more the spirit of wholeness than perfection, and being kind to ourselves on the journey to wholeness that is really my answer. the people that are seeking perfection, or the people that do weight training for 6 hours a day and are on these very stoic, strict diet. I don't advocate that sort of thing. I think that there's a lot of violence and a lot of aggression that usually comes with that attitude, not towards other people, but towards ourselves. But the role that the mind plays is very large. We can, if you add the level of anxiety and regret to what is already more of an organic situation, that immediately makes it worse, immediately generates suffering. And so there I would talk about the difference between necessary suffering and unnecessary suffering. And I think we need to learn how to experience necessary suffering. Pain is pain. Learning how to relate to pain is a good thing. And I don't believe that the goal should be to escape, to try and prevent or escape from ever feeling pain. Pain is pain.
Just as with any of the centers, with any of the bodies, you have a sliding scale. Like with the lower solar plexus, which is about personal identity, on one end of the scale you have people who have no boundaries whatsoever. And on the other side of it you have people who are hidebound, just locked in their own self, and they practically have no sense of anyone else being on the planet except to serve them. Well, the emotional body is very much like that. It's a very wide range. So what you begin to look at when you are going through the emotion phase of the initiatory process is a sense of balance. Are you shut down emotionally? Are you too emotionally free? There's a wonderful scene in Lawrence of Arabia where someone is asking Lawrence how he manages to be so in control and so stoic and go out there and do the things that he does. And he takes a flame and he holds it beneath his hand and it burns. And the guys watching are going, ow, ooh. And one of them says, how can you do that? Doesn't it hurt? And he says, oh, but of course it hurts. The trick is not to mind that it hurts. And that's it. Controlling, now you'd say, well, that's controlling the physical body, but it's controlling that emotion of pain, that sense of pain, that sense of suffering. And of course, throughout the course of the story, which is his biography, you see that it holds him in good stead in that story.
It's often our most painful times in our lives are also periods where we have the greatest amount of growth spiritually. And I've found that true personally, and I've always found that to be a terrific motto to have for my therapy clients, in my practice. And I will occasionally, not oversay it like a cliche, but occasionally find myself wanting to remind both of us, all of us, that it's not necessarily bad news when it's bad news.
Well, we only label something as a negative event or a loss or a pain when we're comparing it to something that we think it's supposed to be. And when we don't see the benefits at that moment.
On one level it's bad news, but that there is a silver lining. And I'm a guy that's suspicious of silver lining talk.
Because there's never a loss without a gain. There's never a pain without a pleasure. There's never a negative without a positive. In the universe, you can't have one. Now, the quality of your life is based on the quality of the questions you ask. So if you don't learn to ask a question, where's the other side? Then you're going to wallow in the illusion of the one-sidedness. Just like if you see a magnet, you think, oh, that's a negative pull of a magnet. You don't realize that if you cut the magnet in half and try to get that negative pull, you can never get it. It's always a positive and negative. No event is one-sided. It's always neutral, until you choose to see only one side of it. So if you perceive that there's only a negative event and a loss there, then that's your choice. That's your perception.
But from my own experience of myself and countless, well, not quite countless, others who I've worked with over 20 or 30 years, I think there is a silver lining to suffering, because there's a transition that takes place into a level of maturity and what I call seasoning of people that have gone through pain and suffering and have gone crazy with it, but then have come through it with some kind of dignity and some kind of seasoning that makes them much better people because of it. And they know that. It's very easy to talk about that on a kind of cliche-ish way.
You're expecting yourself to be happy and never sad, kind, never cruel, positive, never negative, nice, never mean, giving, never receiving, etc. When in truth, you're a human being with a set of values, and you want both sides. Sometimes you're nice, sometimes you're mean, sometimes you're kind, sometimes you're cruel. And you got to embrace both sides of your life and set objectives accordingly. Can you see that it is never what happens to you on the outside, it's how you master your perceptions from the inside? Because the master is the one who realizes there's nothing but transformation, never gain and loss. And you just now got a good example of that possibility. So if you ever have a situation you think there's a loss, you look at where you gain. You think you have a negative, you look for the positive. You think you have some sort of pain, you look for the pleasure. Because as Anaxagoras said 2,500 years ago, pain and pleasure are simply lopsided perceptions. So when somebody feels that they're having a major setback, the truth is they're not. They just think they are. Because they haven't learned how to master their perceptions.
We should also point out here the difference between pain and suffering. All creatures can feel pain if they have nerves and a brain. However, as far as we know, only humans actually suffer. Suffer is the emotion that interprets the signal from the brain as pain. So it's not just that, pulling away from the stimulus, but it's actually having a personal attachment to what is happening. And that's what a lot of the more austere disciplines will really get into, is a lot of inflicting pain and teaching you how not to suffer even though you are experiencing pain. Not my idea of a good path to go down, but it is one, and it's a valid one for people who choose to go that way. And it certainly has been one of the paths for many, many eons. So it's a really good example for us as we go through this particular step of the initiatory process to keep in mind that the emotions are supposed to be like the physical body, like the lower mind, something that we have. It's not us. And not to get so wrapped up in it that we break the trust to our higher selves, that we separate ourselves from that which we truly do love.
It is the question of self-awareness. So if you can do it, and in order to do it, you have to already be self-aware, otherwise you're instantly lost in the IRS or the car on fire. So the object is to do exactly what you would do otherwise, with the directed attention, is to try and get the IRS off your back, or the car unfired. But it's done from a different inner standpoint, as it were. And even if you fail, which you do most of the time, the onus is on you. You take responsibility for your own emotions. This is a very, very difficult thing to do. And most of us fail right through life. But it has a different taste to it. In other words, it's not the fault of the IRS that you have got yourself in a tizzy, or the fault of the car because you're absolutely in a state to try and get to quench the fire. So the whole thing takes on a different, let's say it has a different taste. And over enough time, if the work is done with some semblance of honesty and consistency, then it starts to show results. I mean, the IRS will still call, but your reaction to it will be very different.
Like the previous registers, Part of assuming the reins of emotional autonomy is recognizing and taking responsibility for our emotional output.
And so control over the emotions means that you are responsible for what you are making. You know, humanity en masse is getting that, you know, we've got to be physically responsible. Because in the old days, when you polluted your land, you just made war and took over somebody else's. Or you explored new territory. Or you went from castle to castle and had your servants clean out the dung in the one that you left. But now we live in a world where what we put in the oceans affects all of us. What we put in the air affects all of us. And so we have to be physically responsible. We're not quite there yet, but we are really getting it as a globe that, you know, we're not going to have a planet if we don't do something fairly quickly. We have yet to reach that point emotionally.
Proactively maintaining a purposeful and intentional state allows one to operate more securely than passively allowing random emotions to be forced upon us. This leads to a recognition that maintaining a specific emotional state has subtle effects on the lower and higher senses, and correctly applied can hold the key to accessing truly magical states of higher awareness and experience.